When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. So when a Game of Thrones breaks out and nobody's sure who has the most support, when you need to rally people to your side, what would you be willing to promise? Would you make a promise that you don't know if you can keep if it meant the difference between potentially winning and losing a war? Would you make a promise that you know you couldn't keep if it meant winning a war that you might otherwise lose? When does it become worth just promising whatever it takes to get the people on your side right now and then dealing with the consequences later? And when these promises go unfulfilled or money is delayed for a time, who along the chain does that burden fall on? And what are the real human consequences of all of that? This is something that's being set up in House of the Dragon Season 2 as well as in the main A Song of Ice and Fire novels. As war breaks out and winter is coming, what kind of false promises are being made and what effect is that going to have? We just saw a number of scenes in Season 2, Episode 5 that highlighted this little dynamic, and I think it's something really worth diving into. The first one was something that I had been paying attention to ever since I noticed Rhaenyra wasn't quite keeping up the agreement that she had with the Vale. There was a promise of a dragon to defend the Vale, and instead she's just sending them a few little baby dragons and some kids to keep them safe. I was wondering how this was going to be responded to in the Vale, and it turns out the answer is that Lady Jane Eyre is just going to straight up call out Rhaena about it to her face, which is probably the right thing to do. The words that we heard the promise described as was a dragon to guard the Vale. This is not really living up to that idea now, is it? Jane Eyre points out how this leaves them powerless to defend against a dragon attack, and Rhaena's like, sorta like how I'm powerless to do anything about the fact that we don't have a spare dragon. And then they just kind of both realize, okay, well, there's nothing either of us can do about this situation right now. I guess we're gonna have to deal with it. There was a fairly significant broken promise worked into Daemon's storyline as well this episode, and I'm not sure Daemon himself even noticed it because he was very tired when all of the fallout happened, and he was still having weird Weirwood dream hallucinations. But if you pay attention to what he told Willem Blackwood after they got done threatening the Brackens, and Lord Bracken basically did cool guys don't look at big dragons, well then you would have heard him say there are certain things that the crown cannot be seen doing. And if you pay attention in the meeting when he's getting called out by the other river lords, it's said that the people doing this were flying the Targaryen banner. So directly Willem Blackwood disobeyed Daemon and used the Targaryen banner to do horrible things in the name of Daemon and in the name of Rhaenyra. Now, on the one hand, Daemon is the one who suggested they do those things in the first place, but on the other hand, he was very clear that the crown cannot be seen doing these things. So you can definitely count this as a broken promise of wartime. Willem Blackwood wants to use the crown for his own ends, so he's willing to let them suffer the damage of all of these horrible atrocities, and he can use their banner to hide under. And we've already had the fallout of the crown being seen doing these things that the crown must not be seen doing. It has cost them the goodwill of many of the vassals of the Riverlands and has lost them a bunch of swords in the army that they are trying to build. And speaking of Daemon and false promises, where exactly is he getting the gold to pay for the restoration of Harrenhal that he's currently undertaking? It would seem to me that he is using a promise that he will pay for it later, but he knows that if he doesn't win this war, it's not going to matter anyway because he'll probably be dead, and if he does win the war, he's going to be able to take the money from someone else to pay for it eventually. This is very reminiscent of some promises made by some characters in A Dance with Dragons as winter sets in and war is coming, but we'll talk about that more a little later on in the video. Now, we have to assume that Daemon isn't riding around on Caraxes with enough gold to restore Harrenhal, so he's obviously promising the gold is going to come from somewhere. There's obviously a bunch of gold on Dragonstone, but I don't think that's necessarily where he's planning to pay for these restorations, but no matter where he intends to get the gold from eventually, the result is the same for all of the people who are supplying the building materials or doing the labor. They are being paid with a promise of gold to come later, rather than being paid up front. The type of real human cost that this could have on all of those unnamed characters working in the background is something that would be pretty easy to miss, but just to drive it all home, the show is putting it front and center in the storyline of another character, the Smith who is being paid in promises by Aegon, and we are seeing directly how promises can't feed his family or do anything for his sick daughter. They don't have enough to eat, and he's trying to tell his wife that the king promised, and she has to just tell him flat out, the king lied. Promises don't matter when they aren't going to be kept on time when it's something that is life or death. It's also definitely worth noting that then they try to flee King's Landing with their sick daughter to get her some amount of help and get her to somewhere where they at least have enough food to eat, but instead they're stopped when the gates have been closed at the order of Aemond, something that he did because so many of the small folk were leaving and talking about how bad things were in King's Landing. So basically, just so that the small folk aren't talking trash about him, there is a little girl who is now likely to die because they can't get out of the city. These are the real human costs that these seemingly small decisions made by the king or the royals are having on real people. You could just imagine that if Daemon doesn't find some gold to actually pay for all of the restoration he's going to be doing at Harrenhal, there are going to be multiple instances just like this where people are starving, waiting for his promises to come through. It's also a good display of the type of problems you run into when you have to actually go and acquire physical gold coins in order to actually pay for anything. When there's no such thing as credit or promissory notes that can be exchanged for goods, you have people that starve when you can't actually go and acquire physical gold. Not having to watch your family starve because you're waiting for physical gold coins to change hands and make their way over to you is really one of those things that makes you appreciate modern finance and just modern society in general. Something that's really interesting about all of these promises that are being made in House of the Dragon as Westeros falls into war as winter is approaching is how they mirror what is going on in our main series in the novels. Just take a quick look around the most recent books, and you're going to see a number of situations that are playing out exactly like this, and we're actually inside of the characters' heads as they're making these decisions to make promises that they themselves know they might not even be able to back up, but they realize that it's better to make a promise that you can't actually back up than it is to starve to death during the winter. This is exactly the logic that Jon Snow is using when he's meeting with the representative from the Iron Bank. He's taking out massive loans that he wonders if the Night's Watch will ever be able to even repay, but he has to do it because he needs to get food for winter. Jon's choice is summed up like this in A Dance with Dragons. A long hard winter will leave the Watch so deep in debt that we will never climb out, Jon reminded himself. But when the choice is debt or death, best borrow. And also, you have to keep in mind that in this world, and when war is breaking out, losing power can be the same as death. So, when it comes to borrowing on promises you don't know if you'll be able to keep, or losing your power, you're always going to make those promises. This is the logic of someone like Daemon, who is probably commissioning a bunch of work at Harrenhal on a promise that he will have to find gold later to repay, and this is also the logic that is used by Cersei in the main storyline when she's also treating with the Iron Bank. The crown is already in debt to the Iron Bank, and Cersei figures she might as well just run it up even higher, because if they lose this war, it doesn't matter anyway. If Daemon is planning to pay for the restoration of Harrenhal using gold that he gets as spoils of war, it would also be very similar to a promise that Tyrion is making in the main book series. In A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion basically ends up selling himself into a sellsword company. And because he's Tyrion Lannister, he's not much of a fighter, but his value comes from the fact that he can make them a bunch of promises for things that he can pay them once they take back Westeros. Similar to Daemon planning to restore Harrenhal so that he can go and fight a war so that he can get the gold to pay for restoring Harrenhal, Tyrion is sitting there thinking about how he's basically making promises that he has no way of keeping unless the people who he is making the promises to end up going and basically taking the stuff for themselves. And then he will give it to them officially, but they're the ones who are already having to take over Westeros anyway. As Tyrion is making these promises and signing these papers, he's actually thinking to himself, should I kick and scream more? Should I pretend that I'm getting screwed harder in this deal? Because really, I'm not actually promising them anything. If we end up winning and taking over Westeros and I get Casterly Rock, well then sure I can make good on all of these promises. But if I don't, well then I'll be dead and all these parchments are going to be worthless anyway. This is the exact same logic that Damon states to Alice Rivers when she asks, what about if you lose? He straight up just says, I'll be dead and none of this will be my problem. When both sides of the conflict are operating under this same logic, it can be difficult to decide who you should actually side with and who you can trust. But then again, in Westeros, it's made a little bit easier because you should probably just side with whoever happens to be pointing a dragon directly at you at this very moment. And of course, I couldn't have a video talking about false promises of gold to be paid later without bringing up our boy Littlefinger, the king of this scheme. That seems to be one of the main things that he's doing in the main book series. He just promises gold to be paid later on the crown's expense and drives up the debt. This is something that Littlefinger can do because he doesn't have any intention of being the one who has to pay for this in the end anyway. He seems to have planned to separate himself from the crown before any of the consequences of all of his debt scheming become apparent. When you take a look at the amount of power and influence and wealth that Littlefinger was able to acquire by just making these false promises over and over and racking up the crown's debt, you can see how the incentives are clearly aligned for someone like Littlefinger to just make all of these false promises. Basically, in all of the situations that we've covered so far, you can see why the people involved need to do what they need to do and why they're making the promises they're making, even if they're not sure that they can actually back them up in the end. Whether it's promising the Vale a dragon for defense and then sending them a hatchling in the hopes that Vhagar doesn't show up and burn the Eyrie, or whether it's restoring the spooky haunted castle that you've taken over on a promise that you're going to take some gold somewhere later and be able to pay for it, or whether you're promising to pay the smith in advance of his work, but in the end he doesn't get that gold on time because maybe you just don't have that gold ready yet. In all of these cases, the most pressing thing is the war that is at hand. And the war is basically going to be what determines whether you can keep any of these promises or not. With both sides making all of these promises that can only be fulfilled if their side ends up winning the war, it's basically going to play out like a giant game of musical chairs where some are going to be left getting what they want and many are not. Another thing that's worth noting, in addition to all of the pressures that the war that is looming are putting on these people making these deals, something that has definitely come up is the fact that some of these deals are being negotiated at a time when they can't actually talk to the person who's in charge. I'm thinking specifically of when Jace has been out negotiating on Rhaenyra's behalf. He first promised that they could spare a dragon to defend the Vale, something that he didn't get to fly home and ask his mom about. He just kinda had to either accept that, or they could potentially lose the support of the Vale. So what did he do? He promised them that they would have a dragon to defend the Vale, and then he went home and told his mom about it. Then, also in this episode, we see him negotiating with the Freys at the crossing, and he promises them Harrenhal even though he hasn't stopped by to talk to Daemon and made sure that Daemon hasn't already promised Harrenhal to someone else, or made sure that Daemon is actually able to even grant Harrenhal eventually to anyone. Nope, they just decide, okay, if we win the war, I guess the Freys need Harrenhal, and he flies home and tells his mom about it. So if the Freys now allow the Northerners to cross, which is what Jace went to negotiate for, and then Jace flies back home to Dragonstone and talks to Rhaenyra and says, hey, I promised the Freys that they could have Harrenhal if they allowed our troops to cross. They crossed, now what do we do? And Rhaenyra says, well, we can't give them Harrenhal, we need to give it to someone else for whatever other reasons. That would be very similar to the broken promise of the Red Wedding in the main series. There was an army marching from the north that needed the quickest way across the river, so they negotiated a crossing at the Twins, and then eventually the terms of that deal were not kept up. But the crossing had already happened, so what can you do? That's just kind of what's happening with a lot of these broken promises of wartime in these stories. In the end, there's a party that has to sit there and decide either we're going to have to sit here and take this, or we're going to have to do something about it. In Walder Frey's case, obviously, he decided to do something about it. Now, I'm not trying to say that anyone is going to take doing something about it quite up to the Red Wedding levels that Walder Frey did, but you never know. It is a dangerous game to be making these false promises with war on the horizon when you don't know if you can actually back up the things that you're saying. The way that so many of the situations our characters are facing in House of the Dragon mirror a lot of the situations that are faced by characters in the main series is something that's really interesting, and the way that all of these promises of wartime are going to play out over the long run is something that I'm definitely going to be paying attention to going forward. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you've made it this far. There's going to be plenty more to talk about as we continue to get new episodes of House of the Dragon. So I'll be back with something else very soon.